Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 16th chapter in the book of Acts. We're going to take it from the 16th verse all the way to the 40th, the whole way home. And one of the things we read of in the previous chapter, there are two things we read of: the Jerusalem Council, where certain controversies and issues were settled by apostolic unanimity, and one of the things was that circumcision was not necessary for Gentile converts. Interestingly enough, Timothy, who we meet in the early chapter, at Paul's insistence, he was circumcised. And the second thing we read of is the tail end of Paul's first missionary journey. It's in the company of Barnabas. He is his traveling companion. And in the 36th verse, Paul wants to go back and revisit the cities and edify them. But Mark, who was Barnabas's cousin, also the author, John Mark, also the author of the Gospel, which bears his name, kind of relented. And then we read in the 40th verse, Paul chose Silas and went off. So Silas is... The 16th chapter marks the second missionary journey. There are three of them recorded in the book of Acts, and the first place it takes him is Europe, as we read. So first verse, we meet Timothy, the man who grows in the affection and esteem of Paul, and he is of Jewish and Greek stock, and he has a good reputation, but it's at Paul's insistence that he is circumcised because of the Jews. So many Jews were not comfortable with the ruling of the Jerusalem assembly, so the Jerusalem council. So Paul makes an exception in Timothy's case, but his other pastoral protege, the other one to whom a pastoral epistle is written and directed, Titus, he was not circumcised at Paul's insistence to make a certain point, and the assemblies were strengthened in the faith and increased in number every day. So Paul is evangelizing and he is edifying. But then what's interesting is that the Ruach Kadesh, who is the one propelling the mission, forbids them. He closes a door when Paul and Timothy and Silas want to go to Asia, eastward. He sends them westward eventually. They try and go another direction. The Spirit also prohibits them. They tried to go to Bithynia, which was to the north of Asia Minor, but he directs them to the European continent. He is directed by a voice from Macedonia begging, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." And when he saw the vision, immediately we sought to go to Macedonia, concluding that the Master had called us to bring the good news to them. So the we, it marks, that's when the pronoun is significant. So every time you read we after Acts 16:10, that means Luke is personally involved. So he was there. We just want to get the picture. It is Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke, at least. And they sail there, and they go to Philippi, which is the principal city of that part of Macedonia, a colony, and we were staying in that city for some days. Philippi was the capital of Macedonia, the neighboring nation to the north. It was named after the father of Alexander the Great, Philip of Macedon, Philip II, who conquered the Greek city-states, and it was under his son that they eventually conquered the world. But conquering Greece was no easy task, and because Philip did what he did, Alexander was able to do what he did. It was the capital city. It lay on the strategically significant for trade routes. It was 10 miles inland, but it was on the east-west plain of a Roman trade route, and it was a colony, and it was a free colony at that. So if you were a citizen of Philippi, you were a citizen of Rome. You had all the rights, responsibilities, and prerogatives. And as we read in the passage we're going to be covering today, they tried to they unwittingly sent Paul and Silas, both of whom were Roman citizens, into jail without due process and beat them, and they get in trouble for that. But they're there for a number of days, and there they meet A certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple from the city of Thyatira, worshipping Elohim, was hearing, whose hearts the master opened to pay attention to what Saul said. So Lydia was a wealthy woman. She was from Thyatira, that is in Asia Minor, but she is in Philippi, and that is one of the 7 churches that receives a message from John in the book of Revelation. And she's a devoted and sincere worshiper of Elohim, and because her worship is aligned with the word, Paul's word clicks with her and she's a captive audience, and she is baptized, as is her family. And then that takes us to the 16th verse. This marks the lesson itself. And it came to be, as we went to prayer, that a certain slave girl possessed with the spirit of Python met us, who brought her masters much profit by foretelling. So this spirit of Python was instrumental in the Greek. The Delphi was their religious site and center, and the oracles there were Python, but we, in the Judeo-Christian mindset, associate it with Satan, and this girl was certainly demon-possessed. She was a slave girl, and she was also enslaved and possessed by a demonic spirit from Satan, and she was used and abused and exploited because she was a ventriloquist. The term ventriloquist is actually demonic in origin. It is when a demon-possessed person speaks, it is not them speaking, but the demon speaking in them, in the strict sense of demon possession. And but even though she's a wretched slave girl, so in the 16th chapter we meet the whole spectrum of socioeconomic evangelism. We meet this degraded slave girl who Paul proceeds to liberate from the enslaving demon. We also meet the middle-aged jailer. We'll get to him when we get to him. And we also already met Lydia, the wealthy businesswoman. And having followed Paul and us, she cried out, saying, "These men are the servants of the Most High Elohim, who proclaim to us the way of salvation." So that is an accurate example of a foretelling. The demons do instantly recognize and submit and bow to the authority, the sovereign authority, the supreme sovereign authority of the superior spiritual entity when they're in his presence, and he lived in these men's hearts, so she was aware. So there was some accuracy. The demons do occasionally offer a correct prediction. And the servants of the Most High Elohim, this is the same language used by the demon-possessed man in Mark 5:7, the demons in him. They instantly recognize the servants in this case, but the Most High, the Son, they are the servants, and their message is the way of salvation. So even whilst demon-possessed, she knows that they have the message of salvation. And she was doing this for many days, but Paul, greatly annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, "I command you in the name of Yahshua Messiah to come out of her." And it came out of her the same hour. So this was a repetitive and a consistent thing for many days. This demon-possessed slave girl kept telling them that they were sent of Elohim, they were on his mission and spreading his message. But enough was enough. Paul was greatly annoyed, and he finally cast out the spirit, not in his own power, but in the name, and with the name comes the power of Yahshua. So when we mention, you can say in the name, in his name, and the demons will tremble, and the devil himself is frightened by the mere mention, that combination of words. And the apostles are granted the power to cast out demons and to heal things, and that's one of the things we witness in Paul, who was an apostle. But when her masters saw that their anticipation of money-making was gone, they seized Saul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to the rulers. So once this demon-possessed slave girl is no longer demon-possessed, that means she has a mind of her own, and she's not going to do their bidding anymore. She is their moneymaker, because this demon in her has some accurate foretelling of the future, some predictive potential for predicts certain potentials that do become actualized. But these men, once more, as it was with the demon-possessed man in the other side of the Sea of Galilee in Mark 5 and also Matthew 8 and Luke 8, the business, the economic motive interferes with their acceptance of the Savior. So these, same thing that they evangelize in the city of Ephesus, the idol makers were threatened by them. So the economics, they lost their money maker. This was their means of ripping people off by giving them false hope, and they are angry and they drag Paul and Silas to the marketplace, to the rulers. And having been brought them to the captains, they said, "These men, being Jews, greatly disturb our city." So they're resorting to ethnic prejudice. Jews were not, and Philippi was a very Roman city. Its citizens called themselves Romans, and they were proud of it. But it was also originally Grecian, Macedonian people. But Jews would have been foreigners. There was not an active Jewish assembly because there wasn't even 10 Jewish families. That was enough to form a synagogue in any location. But they're disturbing our city. All they did was unleash the uproar and the instant gravitation and the envy of these men, who they were the ones who were greatly disturbed. And they proclaim practices which are not right for us to receive, nor to do, being Romans. So Judaism was an accepted, legally tolerated form of religion by the Roman Empire. Christianity had yet to emerge into a distinct religious entity, and when it did, it went through a series of persecutions through the emperors. But what's interesting here is he's appealing to their status as Romans, and they are completely oblivious to the fact that the men they had just dragged and beat and dragged into jail without due process were, like them, Roman citizens, and that would have been a violation of their rights, and eventually they get in trouble for doing what they did to fellow Roman citizens who all they could see was their Jewishness. Yet they also preached something that was distinct from Judaism, Christianity, and that would have been unlawful because it was not recognized, or it could not be accepted without being recognized and tolerated by the Romans, who were generally religiously lenient. They subscribed to the theory of polytheism, where the gods were to be respected on their territories, their lands, and they would have considered Yahweh to be the national deity of Israel, and they wouldn't want to interfere with the worship of him on their own land. And the crowd rose up together against them, and the captains tore off their garments and commanded them to be beaten with rods. So they did succeed in stirring up a mob frenzy because they had gathered in public. They did this in public, and the aim of doing it in public was to generate publicity, stir the crowd up into an uproar against them. And the captains, they're the ones who have the rods in their hand, or the ones who have the rods are directed by the captains who are tearing off their garments, and they're telling them to beat them with rods. So this is a big no-no if they are Roman citizens, which in fact they are. And having laid many blows upon them, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to keep them safely. So they beat him. It doesn't say how long, but they certainly, gave a few good whacks of them with these rods. I think 39 lashes was the maximum legal number of times one could be whipped. But, it's got to be different with rods. But they're in prison, and they're commanding the jailer to keep them safely. So the jailer is entrusted to the task of making sure that he is securely in there and that he doesn't go anywhere. And that's going to come into play because the jailer contemplates suicide. He's ready to draw his sword into his own stomach once this earthquake erupts out of nowhere. who having received such a command, put them in the inner prison and fasten their feet in the stocks. So they are in maximum security prison by the standards of ancient world. They're in a prison inside a prison, so this is the segregation unit, and they are fastened in their feet. That means they can't even move to go to the bathroom with their feet fastened. So they are going nowhere. It would literally take divine intervention for them to get up and move or have any motion or life, but that's precisely what happens. And at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing songs to Elohim, and the prisoners were listening to them. So they weren't completely alone. There was other people in their proximity or adjacent to them, and they could hear the song of the night, which is they are praying and praising, even though their circumstances are nothing to be praised for. They are grateful, nevertheless, to be called to suffer for his name's sake, as the apostles were similarly worded in Acts 5:41. And suddenly a great earthquake took place, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened, and all the chains came loose. So if for any reason you find yourself in prison for proclaiming the good news message, don't expect this to happen, even if you are praying and singing praises to his delight. But he had a very specific, this great earthquake was clearly divinely foreordained, and so in some sense the jailer was blameless. Remember, his concern was his own life, so he's contemplating death when Paul intervenes with the message of life and makes a convert out of him and his family. So he would have a valid excuse to his superiors, because this earthquake was clearly meant that a divine power was working on their behalf. So the prisons are shaken up, and all the doors are opened, and all the chains are loose. All that adds up to divine intervention. And the jailer, awakening from sleep and seeing the prison doors open, thinking the prisoners had fled, drew his sword and was about to kill himself. So this jailer, I don't know if sleeping on duty was permitted, so in that sense he is, I guess he is sleeping on duty, and he can see this vast earth-shattering earthquake is going to wake him up from his restful state, and he's going to see the prison doors open, and he's going to draw the conclusion that the prisoners had fled under his watch, and he was entrusted to this. This was a life or death assignment, so he's willing to take his own life rather than endure the shame and humiliation of having let down his superiors and failed in his task and duty. But Paul called with a loud voice, saying, Do no harm to yourself, for we all are here. So Paul could have easily let this man draw the sword in his stomach or his heart or wherever else it was headed, but Paul was not that type of person. He saw a soul in despair, in need of uplift and salvation, and his worst fears, they hadn't escaped yet. They were still here. So that ultimately helped save their lives and his life. And asking for a light, he ran in and fell down trembling before Paul and Silas. So he is in a state of abject fear. He's in darkness, and the prison doors have been opened and the chains have been loosed. But the men who he thought, every other one of them probably just ran straight out the door. But these men, the ones to whom he had been specifically entrusted to guard and make them safe, guard them safely, keep them safely and securely there, were there, and he is trembling before them. And having led them outside, he said, Masters, what do I have to do to be saved? Now this is a question worthy of all consideration, and the motive which is prompting the question is desperation. So he's aware that he is on death's door, and what must I do? Because he was about to die in his sins. So what must I do to be saved? There's nothing you can do, so there is an incorrect word in that question. Salvation is not the process of works or doing. It is a matter of faith and belief and grace, and that alone. And they said, Believe on the Master Yahshua Messiah, and you shall be saved, you and your household. So it's nothing he can do. You don't have to do anything but believe, or be anybody but a believer, in order to be saved and secured in salvation. And it is a matter of faith. It is not a matter of works. And his household, we find them that they are invited guests to his house, where he baptizes, and the joy of conversion is shared from the family. So this individual experience has a ripple effect which extends beyond the individual straight to his family, so that the gospel is being spread even in his chains. As he would write in his epistle to the Philippians several years later. And they spoke the word of Yahweh to him and all who were in his house. So the word of Yahweh is the converting message. The ministry of conversion is the Spirit, start to finish. We are but instruments and vessels, but if we preach the message in the right way at the right time to the right person, the Spirit will work his wonders. Inside our audience, they will stir up their heart to repentance. But it all has to be fundamentally in agreement on the foundation of the word of Yahweh in order for it to be an authentic conversion. And taking them in that hour of night, he washed their wounds, and immediately he was baptized, he and all that were his. So he tended to their wounds. They were beaten with rods mercilessly before they were thrown into jail for no good reason other than threatening the livelihood or eliminating the livelihood of this demon-possessed slave girl's master, who was their slave, and she was a slave of Satan and for her designs. But the urgency is expressed in the word immediately. He was baptized, he and all that were his. Now, if they are guests in his home, that means there is no river or bath to immerse them. So it might have been baptism by sprinkling. We don't know, but that's one of the mistakes that can be made, such as, for instance, we find in Cornelius's household. He and his family, in all probability, were baptized by sprinkling rather than immersion. And having brought them into his house, he put food before them, and he rejoiced with all his household, having believed in Elohim. So the causational effect of conversion is rejoicing and joy. It is a joyous occasion, and it sustains us through our conversion, which is not a one-time event, but a lifetime endeavor. We must always endeavor to keep the spark of our conversion alive and in motion because if we let it relapse or retreat into inertia, then we are living as if we were unconverted. So we want to have it alive at all times in all places, and that joy that it gives can sustain one, and the joy of the message received is compared by the Savior himself in John 16:21 to a woman giving childbirth, and the joy, all the pain and all the ardor that she has to endure in that process becomes instantly and permanently eliminated and undone when she has the joy of the birth, the baby in her arms. And that is certainly the situation with this jailer, because he was in pain, he was in despair, he was ready to kill himself, and now he is receiving the message of life. So much like the woman would be holding life in her arms, and no woman who's ever given birth has regretted the pain. That may be an oversimplification, but in any case, moving on. And when the day came, the authorities sent the officers, saying, "Let these men go." So they had enough. They instantly recognized that there was no sense in keeping these men in jail. A superior power was clearly working on their behalf. So the captains, they said they had enough. They weren't willing to meddle or mess with this man who wasn't really a troublemaker anymore, because they had brought trouble on themselves. An earthquake let an entire prison of prisoners running loose on the street because they had wrongfully imprisoned these people. And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, "The captains have sent to let you go. Now then, come out and go in peace." So the jailer is not is not not going to be fired or anything else. What he is converted. So his superiors relayed the message to him, and he would not be reprimanded or in trouble for this earthquake, which was literally beyond anyone's control. He was asleep, so that kind of stirred the confusion that, oh my God, what have I done? I fell asleep, and then all the prison's loose, but then there's this earthquake, and the men that he had been entrusted with are there, and they give him the converting message. And he tells them, the one who had converted them from the word of Yahweh, that you can go in peace. But Paul said to them, they have beaten us publicly, uncondemned, being Romans, and they have thrown us into prison. And now do they throw us out secretly? No, indeed. Let them come themselves and bring us out. So Paul's standing firm on his, remember that word, being Romans, they used it themselves in verse 21. Paul is standing firm on his status and privilege and prerogative as a Roman citizen. What they did was completely illegal. Now, citizens were distinct. Any subject of the Roman Empire could be beaten and dragged and imprisoned without due process, but things were a little different when you were a Roman citizen. So Paul is appealing to the full extent and consequences and ramifications of that status when he says what he just said. And the officers reported these words to the authorities, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Romans. So they made the fatal mistake of treating a Roman citizen like a subject. Now, subjects were, the Romans were in complete control, and they were their military masters, so they could wind up a non-citizen subject and do what they did, but them being Romans changes the whole equation. They lost the legal, moral high ground, and so they're in fear because they know that they could be in trouble for doing what they did to Roman citizens presumptuously, because they were so wrapped up in the mob frenzy that they didn't even take the time to ask if are you guys Roman citizens, or whatever the standard protocol for ascertaining that information or giving it. They didn't want to listen to Paul until now. And having come, they pleaded with them and brought them out and asked them to leave the city. So they're begging them to leave the city. They knew that they were not troublemakers, but trouble followed them nonetheless. They didn't want the powerful deity that was working on their half working against them. So they plead with them and pray for them just to go peacefully. The work is already done, and the assembly is already the harvest is already, the seed is already planted, and it does grow effectively from there. And it is the original European site of Christianity. So coming out of his prison, he went to Lydia, and seeing the brothers, they encouraged them and went forth. So Lydia was the wealthy seller of purple dye from Thyatira, whom we met in the 14th verse. She is the original convert of Philippi, and they returned to her after leaving the prison with unmended wounds between them and the authorities, but they encouraged them, and they went forth. So they did not lose the momentum. They went forth, and then we find them in Thessalonica, and then Berea in Macedonia, and then in Athens, which is to the south of Macedonia, the Greek mainland city. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.